Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
We were just having a very delightful discussion before we hit the record button tonight about our upcoming Beyond the Grave event, which will happen this October at Evergreen Cemetery in Colorado Springs, and hopefully locally at Fairmount Cemetery as well in Denver. So we will have more information with those dates and everything for you very, very soon. But Diane and I tend to get carried away sometimes when we start talking about what we could do for the next year.
To make We're planning for next year. We haven't started this one yet.
I know. We've only just really begun. The script is in the process of being written and put together. And I'm super excited because I know we've announced it before, but we are doing, our script is based on Dracula, the novel this year.
Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yes. And it's going to be so fabulous. I haven't read the novel in a very long time. It's been several years since I read it. So I was rereading it in order to put the script together. And there's all these like little nuances and little things I had completely forgotten about until I started delving back into the story. And I forgot, quite literally, how central a cemetery is to a good portion of the story until I got back into it. And I was like, I forgot they went and sat in the cemetery all the time. There's a whole scene that takes place at night in the cemetery. And I forgot how well that ties into what we're doing with our fundraiser for the cemeteries.
Absolutely perfect. And then especially for those in Colorado Springs, it's like we're sending out a save the date card. So on the 13th day of October, and the 14th day, but the 13th day is the most important. Please mark that on your calendars.
It just happens to be a Friday for 2023. Yes. So keep that in mind. We're just super excited. And this is where it starts, folks. We have to start in July and plan it. But you know what? I don't know, for anybody who's active on social media, especially Instagram, like anymore, or Halloween starts July 5th, day after 4th of July. And actually, like if you go shopping at all, Home Goods, Joann's, Hobby Lobby, well, not Hobby Lobby, they don't do Halloween, they do autumn. But Joann's, Home Goods, Michael's, they all do Halloween, and they're all putting their Halloween stuff out now. We also have, if you're here locally in Colorado, the annual Central City Cemetery Crawl is coming up in August. I have been asked to participate in it once again, so I'm looking forward to that. I'm just waiting to be assigned my person who I will be talking about this year, or portraying, I should say, not even just talking about, I get to portray somebody, which I love doing. It's what's keeping me from chopping my hair off right now, actually.
Your what?
The Central City Crawl and doing a portrayal of a historic woman is what keeps me from chopping my hair off.
Oh, I thought you said that's why you were going to chop your hair off. Excuse me, what?
No, it's what's keeping me from chopping it off, because I'll want to do some sort of historic hairstyle, I'm sure. And so this keeps my hair long right now. But I've had these last few days that have been so hot.
When I cut my hair short, it was like, well, crap, I can't do anything with it now.
Couple of years ago, 2 years ago, when I did the first one, my hair was much shorter, and I ended up buying fake hair in order to make my hair look like I could do a bun, because I didn't have enough real hair to do it then. But
yeah, I can't do that because my hair changes colors so often that I can never find hair pieces to match the current color.
Well, so my hair, if listeners haven't paid attention, my hair is a darker blonde. Mm-hmm. So the hair piece I got, it's a fake bun. It was too blonde. It was like too light for my hair. I actually got some of that root touch-up spray and sprayed it on, and I was able to blend it pretty well to my color.
Good.
It worked out pretty good. So, but yes, I will keep my hair long for right now. But hopefully I'll have the dates. I know the dates have been announced. So if you are local and you're interested in attending that, I think tickets are already on sale for that. It's through the Gilpin County Historical Society. So you can go online to their museum and get the tickets for that. But it should be a good time this year.
It is the last Saturday in August.
Hopefully I'll have more details to announce next week on that. But yes, if you live locally and you're interested in going to the cemetery crawl in Gilpin County, it's a fantastic way to learn about the folks that are buried up there, the history of Gilpin County. This year, they're going to be at the Knights of Pythias Cemetery. So, which is exciting because we've done so much on the Knights of Pythias recently. So I'm excited to be spending some time in that particular cemetery. As always, I love being in that one. So it'll be great. But today we thought we would do sort of a follow-up episode to last week, mostly because our guest, Bob Stovall, who was great at portraying General William Palmer, who is the founder of Colorado Springs. He kept alluding several times in last week's episode to General Palmer's wife, Queen, who Diane has portrayed many, many times, knows her story very, very well. So we thought it was only appropriate that we follow up this episode with Queen's story and her side of things, because really Bob focused on Palmer himself, how he came to Colorado, how he founded not only Colorado Springs, but an entire railroad system that connected all of Southern Colorado to the rest of the Southwest and to the rest of the US, to be honest.
Yeah, it was, I think, a lot more than people here locally in Colorado Springs, unless they really have researched General Palmer and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. They don't know to the extent of what he did to actually build this state.
Right. And we actually had somebody just the other day comment on our Facebook post about last week's episode that they're a 4th generation Coloradoan and they had never heard of him before. So I don't know what part of Colorado this person is in, which may be why they hadn't heard of him, but they were all excited to hear the episode because, you know, they had commented they didn't know anything about him. So they got to learn something new about their home state. So,
well, I could see being up in the northwest corner or the northeast corner, you may not.
Right. If you're a little farther out and don't have the major connection to our bigger cities, including Colorado Springs, you may not have heard about him. And as we know from talking to Bob, there hasn't been a lot written about Palmer. And so what he knows, and he's been portraying Palmer for many years now, but he's had to do a lot of research and he's gone through like as much as he's been able to find. He's like hungry for all the information on Palmer he can get, but it's a small amount of information considering the amount of things that he did for Colorado. So, but of course,
Palmer definitely wasn't out there with a selfie on top of his railroad cars every 5 minutes. So,
but of course, one of his, aside from founding Colorado Springs, founding railroad systems, one of his other great contributions to the state of Colorado was bringing his beautiful wife, Mary Queen Palmer, out to the state. So Diane, let's start with when and where she was born and kind of who her family was, and we'll go from there.
Well, going back, I usually do this from a written script. So bits and pieces have been just sort of conglomerated together. And so this afternoon I was going through my notebook of stuff on Queen. So there's a lot I've forgotten, and I'm glad we're doing this episode. So Queen Palmer was born Mary Lincoln Mellen in Prestonburg, Kentucky in 1850. And it's hard to go back because when we do it locally, it's like there is so much misinformation about Queen that I can put it into people said this and people said that. So do you want me to do that? Just go. So like a lot of the misinformation. And again, like General Palmer, there is not a lot written about her. So what I have found when I started the research was there was a local author from the 1950s named Marshall Sprague, and he wrote Newport in the Rockies. And for the longest time, that was taken as the Bible of Colorado Springs history. But as more people began doing research and studying more of the women who influenced our community, kind of find out that a lot of what he had written was very disparaging towards Queen and other, early women pioneers. So a lot of people took it as she did not like it here. General Palmer built this lavish castle, which, if anybody's familiar with Glen Erie, it is a castle today, but it was not a castle when she lived here. and she was from England. And that's why she didn't like her.
I had heard that, and I thought that was a weird one because she's definitely not British.
She was not British, and even her family, when I was going back through her genealogy, her grandmother and her grandfather were pioneers on the Minnesota frontier, where their one of their daughters, was the first white child born in Minnesota.
Wow.
So they go back to the 1600s. They were a military family. They were a frontier family. And so I think Queen sort of absorbed a lot of that frontier spirit. Queen's mother was ill. She had a degenerative heart defect. And so her grandmother, Charlotte, after her husband died and the girls were married, she sort of like, how do they say, packed up her own home and then spent the remainder of her years living with her daughters after they were married and settled. So she went to go live with her daughter, Isabel, who was Queen's mother, and stayed with her. Unfortunately, Isabel was very, I just mentioned that, but she was a very frail person, and she died in childbirth when Queen was only 4 years old. And it was actually, they had 2 younger children that lived just to be infants. So Queen Mary Lincoln was actually the eldest child, the only surviving child of Isabel. So it was her grandmother who gave her the nickname of Queen. So one of her younger sisters, Ellen, came to live with William Proctor Mellen, who was Queen's father, to take care of the younger children. And her father, married her mother's sister, Ellen, 2 years later. Ellen was only 23 and William was 42. And then they had 7 more children together.
So I take it Ellen didn't suffer from the same heart condition that her sister Isabel had.
No. In fact, actually, the rest of the siblings were very robust people in what they did. So when so they got married, and then William Proctor Mellen was a law student under Salmon B. Chase, who became part of the Treasury Department under President Lincoln. But he left being a lawyer, and he decided to start investing in coal fields and coal towns and that back in Kentucky and that. But then when the Civil War came, Secretary of the Treasury, Chase, asked him to come, and he was appointed as a special agent for the Treasury Department during the Civil War. So after the Civil War, he then began looking for other income opportunities. And of course, like so many people were at the time, he started looking west. And the story goes, and if you listen to General Palmer's story last week, it was somewhere between Cincinnati and, no, I'm not going to say it right, somewhere in Cincinnati that Queen met General Palmer because her dad was very taken by this young, dashing Civil War hero story of his plans for a railroad.
And I do have a quick question.
Yes, go,
because
please.
We learned, well, I was just thinking about it. We learned from Bob last week that Palmer himself was a Quaker, but also a very strong abolitionist. And it was his abolitionist side of him that made him decide to go ahead and fight in the Civil War, because he really wanted to get rid of slavery. And so it went out over that. Now, I'm asking this, and I don't know, maybe you don't know the answer, but Queen being from Kentucky, which is a southern state, do we know what side? I mean, her father was involved. He didn't fight in the war. He went to work under Lincoln. So I'm assuming,
yeah,
they would have been on the Union side of things.
On the Union side, because then they did, once he moved to, or got appointed in Washington, they actually moved to Flushing, New York, where that's where she grew up. So their time in Kentucky was very, very brief.
Okay.
So
sorry, I just wanted to, I thought about that. I was like, oh, you said she was born in Kentucky, which would have been a southern state, which could have had a conflict there, but I guess not.
Oh, no. They were very much unionist. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Very much a military background of the family from almost the beginning of our country, which is another thing that people don't realize, that they have very deep American roots.
Gotcha.
And granted, and it was said she grew up, with every opportunity given to her as a young woman at the time, but it wasn't without a lot of tragedy. And so going back and looking at this, granted, she met General Palmer. They came west and built a home. And her father was a very integral part of building the business, building the community, that, I don't want to say empire, but the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. And so since his connection was with the coal fields, he established the coal fields outside of Canyon City, which would be Williamsburg and Rockville, and also South Pueblo, which would be close to where the CF&I, which I did not realize until I started researching Palmer, that was because of Palmer that the CF&I in Pueblo existed. And they were living here when her father in 1873 had gone to Cincinnati and he had a stroke.
Aww.
And he died at the age of 60.
Wow.
The following year,
oh no,
her grandmother, who was Charlotte, she was very, very, very close to, decided, from what I was reading, it's like she almost sensed this was her last time to see some of these kids, and she wanted nothing more to see her favorite granddaughter, Queenie, and her husband in their new home. And of course, his sister Ellen was already there, her stepmother aunt, because after her father's death, General Palmer pretty much took on the guardianship of Ellen and her 7 siblings, which ranged in age from 1 to 14 years of age. Father died in November of 1873. Her grandmother died in July of 1873 while they were visiting Glen Erie.
Mm.
So actually, she was buried on the grounds of Glen Erie for a short time, and then she was moved back to, I think it was Connecticut or Cincinnati, one of those keywords. So, we hear about Queen and her elaborate lifestyle, and she didn't like it here, and all this, that, and the other. She had a lot of tragedy.
A lot of heartache, yeah.
A lot of heartache. And even before her father and her grandmother, her uncle, in 1869, was killed in Montana with, he was an Indian agent, and he was killed by an uprising of the Blackfeet Indian up there, which coincided with them coming out here at the same time. And there was articles written about her being afraid of the Indians and all that. That's not my term, that's how they termed it. But, people don't go back and realize, well, she had good reason to be. They had just suffered this horrible loss of their uncle, Malcolm. But with, General Palmer, he was a businessman. He was always gone on survey expeditions on the railroad. So even when he finally told her it was time for them to come out, so she came out, her father came out, whole family came out, he wasn't here to greet her because he was stuck on a survey expedition. In fact, she did not see him for another 3 weeks.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So this is, a brand new bride and all these people, and they were living in like little cabins and stuff until the house was built. But Queen,
definitely not Glen Erie yet.
Definitely not Glen Erie. But Queen was one. I think she had the influence of her grandmother, that she just dug in her heels. She did everything she could to work and build the community, because I truly believe she looked at the Fountain Collie, which is Colorado Springs, at her and General Palmer as partners. They each had their own strengths. So she started the first school. She was the first school teacher. She would ride a buggy in from Glen Erie to the school, which was downtown, which was about a good 2 or 3 miles. There's not, it was pretty rustic back then. She worked with other ladies who lived in the community to gather books, to have a reading room. They would have concerts, anything to like alleviate the boredom. If you can imagine, there was nothing here. There was more tents than anything else in the community. And
they're
she
trying to
actually
bring some culture in.
Yeah. Yes. And she actually started the first city Christmas party for the kids. But she had to leave because of health issues. With her second pregnancy when she had her first heart attack when she was 30. And then she moved to New York and then finally to England. I mean, there was a bunch of back and forth stuff in there.
So she did go to England at some point in her life.
She did go to England, but also her family had moved, her father's second wife, and that they had all moved to England. General Palmer went over there quite often. They had friends over there, investment partners. So it was a logical choice for her to move there. The climate was healthier for her there at the time. So even though she didn't want to leave what they built, she wanted also to see her 3 girls grow to womanhood, because she did not have that opportunity with her mom dying when she was so very young. And so she stayed. She had, she was, I don't say the belle of the ball, but she gathered such a wide assortment of eclectic people. Oscar Wilde's, Sargent the artist, and I'm sorry, I can't think of his first name right now, but she was an heiress. I mean, and her daughters were too, but she did come back one time. She did try to come back. I think it was in 1885, but found the altitude. So if you've ever been to sea level and come up to where we're at, which is about 7,000 feet,
yep,
you know the difficulty of what it is. And if you have a weak heart, then
and she had inherited her mother's congenital heart disease.
Right.
Yeah.
And when I was looking back at her father, how they described him, he had a delicate physical organization, which
I love old medical terms.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, what is that? But, he wasn't a strong, robust person either. So I think what strength she inherited from her grandmother, Charlotte.
And she just had a will to want to live. She, like you said, she wanted to be a mother to her daughters because she didn't have her. She had her grandmother who she adored. And I think Ellen was a good stepmother to her, but it wasn't her mother. And, she had that will to live for her daughters. And yes, living in England was probably a little easier on her heart than up here in the mountains at a higher altitude.
And then even on the trip to Mexico, because
yes, I wanted to know more about this trip to Mexico.
I'm going to try not to do this back and forth as in and out of character, but Rose Kingsley, whose father was an author and he was a major part of the church. I don't want to say Mr. Kingsley because that's just so wrong. I can't think what his canon. He was a canon in the church with Queen Victoria and all that good stuff.
Right.
So they were very high up in the social status even though they were church people, they were very well thought of. So her brother Morris was also part of the land company, and Rose came out. Rose never married. She basically took care of her parents her entire life. But she wrote articles. So she was almost like the journalist on the trip. And from what I read about her, she was very active, very strong, very just loved being outdoors. So she
kind of the opposite of Queen.
kind of the opposite of Queen, but I think that gave Queen the strength she needed, because when they were going into Mexico, and part of the story was, and it was written in Rosa in the book. So this is as first hand get. Is that the gentlemen that were on the trip made sure they knew how to they were proficient in the use of firearms, because Mexico was in a great deal of turmoil at the time. It was right after the Mexican Revolution. So there was a lot of unrest, and they probably wouldn't take kindly to a bunch of, American investors traveling through the deserts of Mexico. So they were brought upon by bandits at one time. And luckily the women were smart enough to remain calm. They hid the pistols under their skirts. The bandits did disarm the gentlemen, but they did not search the women. So luckily, they still had weapons of protection as they rode into Mexico City. And they talked about it being a difficult trip for Queen, but come to find out later on, she was like 2 months pregnant.
Oh, geez.
So they traveled in what was called an ambulance, which would be a heavy duty wagon.
Right.
That they would transport troops or families or whatever in. I can imagine there was no shock absorbers whatsoever.
I was going to say, it's not going to be a comfortable ride at all. It would
not be a comfortable ride. I mean, any protection would be the rolled up canvas that would roll up and down. So going through Mexico, you can imagine, even though I think they went in April, it still would be hot.
Hot and dry.
Hot and dry, yes. But once they got to Mexico City, they toured. There was a priest that took them around and showed them the sights or whatever. But it was said that was the happiest. Queen was the happiest on that trip.
Oh.
And I wonder if it's because she was free, because it was just her. She didn't have to maybe put on any pretensions of being, William Jackson Palmer's wife and had to take care of things at home, or maybe because she was away from her stepmother and all the other little kiddos at the time, that from some of the things I read, they sound like they were a bunch of wild children.
So give her a moment of not having to be the society woman that she normally was.
And then to spend time with her husband, even though there was other people, but just to spend time with her husband and her good friend Rose without.
So I'm assuming because she and Rose had the weapons hidden in their skirts, that's how they outsmarted the bandits and got away.
Mm-hmm. They just let them go on. There was nothing there they could have taken. So they realized that they weren't doing anything wrong. So they just let them go on and finish their trip.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Got it. Yeah, she was. Go ahead.
I was going to say there were benefits to wearing a million petticoats, even in the desert.
Yes.
Okay, a million might be exaggerating, but she probably had 3 or 4 on. So,
I'm sure she did, because
typical of the layers.
They talked about making dresses before they went. That they made cotton dresses. Mm-hmm. So they were in the typical Victorian dresses. They were very smart in preparing for that trip, which was interesting. I mean, it was sort of, if you think about it, it would almost be like her grandmother going out into the frontier of the forts. But here she's traveling someplace they'd never been. It's not like there was books and all this stuff that you could read about.
Right.
And going into this land that's sort of wild and untamed and
a little hostile, yeah.
Yeah, and then this goes to show she was, I think, very brave. A very brave young woman.
Well, and I feel like, so you were talking at the beginning of the episode how there's a lot of misinformation about her, and specifically because of the one author from the 50s. I almost feel like, and I think this has happened to a lot of historical women, we have an idea of what a woman was supposed to be during certain time periods. And so authors and other people would take that idea, and that's just who they were then, without realizing who they actually were. Like, I think Queen was definitely a society woman. She definitely had society friends, obviously, and she hosted major parties, and she did all the things that was expected of a woman of her class to do. But I don't think she was the stuck-up kind of Victorian lady that sometimes gets mentioned for a high society woman. Right,
because oftentimes it was said that because she came from England, which we know she did not, that
she's American born and bred, people.
Yeah, very American and born. That
no offense to our friends in England, though.
No, none. But she thought it was uncivilized for her. She was too much of a socialite and this, that, and the other. But there's stories of her when General Palmer would have clients come out and investors. She would actually a lot of times meet them, take them for hikes up into Queens Canyon, take them for buggy rides around like Garden of the Gods and that. I mean, it's hard to conceptualize it now as being this rugged frontier.
Right.
But there was a time when I think it might have been her first daughter and her stepmother, and when she had a young baby, they were at Glen Erie, and there were still I think it was the Utes that would come and camp right there close to where the house was at. In fact, they would come right up to the house. And so there's a story of one of the Indian women rather perplexed of why they were giving their babies baths. But I mean, it was still that so close to a lot of the conflicts that we had experienced that it still was a very Wild West area at the time. So I think she had every reason to be a little fearful. But I mean, what I meant to say was she didn't shirk from doing some of the getting down and getting dirty and climbing and exploring.
No, she was very down to earth.
Yes.
In that respect. Like she didn't need, again, she did what was expected of her because of who she was and the family she was born into. But obviously she loved General Palmer enough to follow him here, to work in that frontier, to do all the things she did. Like you said, she wasn't always throwing parties. She was also getting down and dirty. And, you know, and I'm sure there were times when entertaining guests, especially if they came from the East Coast, was very different for her because she would have had to think about how to entertain them. You can't just go up the street to the restaurant or whatever. It was going to be very different out here, and she did it anyway.
Yeah, because I think she had that pioneer spirit that she has not been given credit for.
I think they both did. I mean, both of them really, truly had so much to do with settling Colorado, helping the
definitely,
West.
But with General Palmer, you hear about, oh, he's such a great man, and he was, but you also hear about, oh, poor General Palmer. He built this lavish house, but Queen just didn't like it and left. Oh, poor woe is Mr. Palmer. And Queen was always looked at as the villainess in this story. There's really not a lot of sympathy for her or understanding. Yeah, so she's basically like
Augusta Tabor.
It's
like Augusta Tabor. For the longest time, Augusta Tabor got the raw end of the deal when it came to her story because, everybody was fascinated by Baby Doe's beauty, and Baby Doe got the rich husband and she lived the lifestyle that he wanted to live. And Augusta was just so mean and stingy. And it was like, well, no, that's not who she was. But somehow, somewhere in a more modern storyline, her story became that. And I think that's what happened with Queen. And we, like you said, we know Queen worked with the children. She worked with the poor. She helped establish, and we talked about it last week. Before Palmer founded the city of Colorado Springs, it was really Old Colorado City, which was a rough and tumble mining community. It was full of saloons and, the lawlessness and all the things that we think of when we think of the Wild West. And the type of people living there. They didn't have the families there quite yet. They didn't have schools and churches
not yet.
and all those things. It was once Palmer came out and started settling things with the help of his wife, who helped get all of that going. And she was just as important to that part of the founding of Colorado Springs as anybody else.
Because if nothing else, it's like Queen brought the softer, the family, the feminine to the community where General Palmer was doing the guy's stuff, the railroads, the business stuff, where somebody had to stay here and build the rest of it, or there wouldn't be a community.
Right.
And getting back to Augusta, if it wasn't for Augusta, Horace would not have been, he would have been eaten out of a box someplace.
Yeah, he would not have made it as far as he made it without Augusta. And for anybody who hasn't maybe listened to all of our episodes, we actually did cover Augusta. And you can hear Augusta's story. But for people outside of Colorado, the Tabors Horace Tabor became a millionaire from the silver mines up in Leadville. He he was not a miner himself. He'd actually bought into, or he grub staked some other miners who discovered the claim, blah, 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 and it went from there. But he made millions. And at the time, he was still married to his first wife, Augusta. And Augusta had supported him for years through lots of different ventures, lots of different things. She was the one who scraped together pennies. She worked as much as he did.
Postmistress, right? While he was off running around through the hood.
Because he had been assigned a postmaster duty, but he was out doing other jobs. So she was the postmaster in essence. A couple of times she ran general stores. The general store that he actually grub staked out of where they made their wealth on. She was doing a lot of the actual business part of that. She was very good with the numbers, very good with money, very intelligent. But unfortunately, after they got wealthy, Horace really wanted to live the life of a wealthy gentleman, and he wanted to attend social affairs, and he wanted to be able to have a fancy house and show off all this wealth that he was so proud of having. And Augusta was not all about that. She was much more simple, did not care for the big mansion, did not care to go to parties. So in this sort of marital issues that they were having with this, he met Baby Doe, who became Baby Doe Tabor. She was a divorcee who was extremely beautiful. And he fell in love with her. And she was much younger than him, too. That was the other thing. She was several years younger. And they fell in love. Eventually, he got the divorce that he wanted from Augusta, which she did not want to grant him. She was against divorce. And then he and Baby Doe ended up getting married and went their separate ways. Now, Augusta was very smart. When she got her divorce, she managed to get the house, as well as a lot of money. And they had one son together. And she was very smart with the money that she got from her divorce, and managed it very well. She became a philanthropist here in Denver. She gave to a lot of charities. She worked with a lot of the poor and the destitute. And that was what she was dedicating her life to after her divorce. Whereas Horace and Baby Doe were living it all up on the rich side. Unfortunately, when the silver crash happened,
that was it.
There went Horace's side of his fortune, and they lost everything. And so it's a fascinating story that has fascinated people for decades. But for a long time, I think it's changing. I think it's been changing. But for a long time, Augusta got the short end of the stick with that story, because everybody said she was so mean to him all the time, and she was so uptight, and she just, wasn't a nice person, which wasn't true. But it was the narrative that got played of her being this sort of witchy wife, and he left Baby Doe because she was much sweeter and nicer and more beautiful.
Right.
And, and Baby Doe in that respect gets the raw end of the stick too. Honestly, if anybody's going to be the bad guy in the story, I blame Horace. He had the wandering eye. He left his wife for the younger woman. He did all the things. The younger woman took up with the man who had the money because she needed some way to support herself. I don't blame Baby Doe either, but
no, I blame Horace. It's always the man's fault.
Yeah. So I feel like the same thing has happened in Queen's case. I think she was a very supportive wife. I think she did everything she could that her health would allow her to do too.
Right.
When she was in Colorado. And like you said, a lot of times she couldn't handle this altitude because especially with pregnancy and a bad heart and everything, even in a modern age, it can be hard on people to live at this altitude.
And not to mention, let's think about, what they had to wear, corsets and everything else. And even though
the weight of their clothes.
Yes. I read Queen was very progressive in her clothing. And I can't think of the style at the time, but it was a little bit looser than that real confining stuff. But the thing is with Queen is General Palmer, General Palmer wasn't like Horace, where he left her for
no
pretty thing. But no, that's very interesting because, and I think going back to Augusta is, I think is there only that one picture of her, and she looks just very stern, and
there's other pictures of her from when she was younger, but that's the one that circulates the most, where she's in her Pierce Nez.
Yes.
What is it? Not Pierce Nez. Nez Pierce. I said that backwards. Nez Pence.
I can't think
the little glasses that sit on your nose.
Oh, yeah, the little glasses.
Yes. Those, and it's I believe it's a profile picture, or mostly profile picture.
Right, yeah.
But and of course, being a Victorian era photograph, she's not smiling in it. So she does look very stern. But she really had a very kind heart, and she really cared a lot about her community and the people around her. She loved her son dearly. It was the only child they ever had together. And she was a very good mother. And up until Baby Doe came into the middle of the marriage, he had loved her and they had loved each other. But, you know, she also had her ideals and her morals that she was really sticking to. Mm-hmm. And he changed. I mean, they in that respect, the couple grew apart. And again, and even I think even in a modern standpoint, money like that might change a marriage, you know, one way or the other.
Well,
if the couple can't agree on what to do with it.
I remember reading a book, because I like to try to get the oldest published books that I can find instead of a modern one. So I read one from the 1930s. And I think even then, after Horace was with Baby Doe and doing all that stuff, she did not want to divorce him because she thought he would come to his senses and come back. And there was something else that I had read, that once they divorced, and he was senator of Colorado at the time when Baby Doe and he got married, none of the women attended that wedding. No. The men did. The wives did not.
Yeah, the wives were not in support of Baby Doe. They were fully in support of Augusta, which, in all honesty, did not happen often at that time for somebody who was divorced. Mm-hmm. Because divorce was very much frowned upon. And so while it was happening, it definitely wasn't as common as it is now to get a divorce. But a lot of times when a couple divorced, no matter who decided the divorce was going to happen, blah, 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 the woman a lot of times was scorned for it. And she was usually blamed for the marriage not working. Even if she had nothing, even if it wasn't her, it could totally be the husband. And in a lot of cases, it was the husband, because they were the ones that could take things to court, and they were the ones that had that power. They had the money, they had control of all of that. But I think Denver society recognized what Augusta was going through and really knew that it wasn't Augusta's fault, and knew that she was trying to hang on to her marriage and make it work, and knew that she wasn't out to get Horace for his money, you know, and all of that type of thing. And I do think she did get the support of this, because they still supported her philanthropy and stuff after the divorce too. So just somewhere in the narrative, though, something happened and she got turned on as being this like not very nice wife. And I think the same thing happened with Queen.
Definitely.
Where I don't think they thought of her as not a nice wife, but just a very uppity, stuck up English woman, which again, we know she wasn't.
So once misinformation gets out, then it becomes like, that's it. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't until I started researching her. And the reason I think I started researching her is because she was like a black sheep, and I love black sheep. And I knew there would be more to her than this. And she got a bum rap, and I just wanted to change that. But the more you go back to the older newspapers, everything was praise about her. Everything she did, everybody loved her. It wasn't until I think the 1950s and then that's what people read, and then that's the lies that are perpetuated forever.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of historical women, that has been the case until more recently. And there's a bunch of us who are trying to change the narrative for a lot of women, because we want society and the world to know that women really did have a bigger emphasis on the whole of humanity besides just being the home, you know, being at home, giving birth to children. We did a lot more than that. And we
waiting
do
on their husbands hand and foot, because, you know, the husbands need it. I mean, the women could not survive without a husband, because, oh my goodness, she was just helpless without him.
Right. And for anybody who couldn't see, you know, I know you can't see her, Diane's face, but, you know, there was the sticking her tongue out and like, the annoyance of women can't make it without a man.
But I was thinking, as we were talking about Augusta, and I may be opening a huge can of worms. And so if you want to cut this out, you can cut this out. So listeners, you never not even hear this. Wouldn't it be interesting if our listeners had women they would like us to research and tell more of their stories or tell their
absolutely.
Stories.
I would love to, and I really try when we're picking our topics and our people to talk about and stuff, I try to be fair and not focus only on women, only on men, and only on when, like, I'm trying to break it up. But yes, if you have stories of, or if in your own family, if there's a woman in your family who inspired things, but maybe later on down the line, the history went awry. Yeah. And you want to share it with us, we would love to know about those women. Because again, as we say at the beginning of every episode, every life had a story, every life. And so we want to, and we like sharing the stories that have either been completely turned around in history and the facts have gone crazy. Well, and part of it is somebody writes something, then somebody reads that something, and then it gets passed down word of mouth. Then it gets rewritten again, but it gets rewritten incorrectly. And then you start to lose the actual truth of things, right? And then it just starts getting related. And then what was fact now becomes a legend. And sometimes legends are good, but sometimes the legends are not quite correct. And so you have to go backwards from the legend to find the facts. And that's okay. But
and not to say this like wrongly, but I mean, it is women's stories have been pushed aside for the husband's stories. Because like we did a story on Josefa Jaramillo Carson, which was the wife of Kit Carson. And everybody hears about Kit Carson, good, bad, or the ugly. You always hear about Kit Carson. There's so much. But there's his young wife who did and sacrificed so much because of his military experience. She's almost just like a footnote in his life story. And it's stories like that, you know,
we want the footnote stories.
We want the footnote stories.
Yeah, we want to take the story from a footnote and make it its own story. So yes, listeners, if you have those kind of stories, please share them with us. We would be happy to put them on the show. If you'd like to be a guest yourself and talk about it, if you've done your own major research into somebody and you think more people need to know their story, please reach out to us. We will be happy to have you guys on the show to share those stories and make those stories not just a footnote anymore.
I like that.
I do too. I like that, to make stories not a footnote, to go beyond the footnote, something along those lines. I like that.
We could be opening a whole can of worms now, so we got to reel this back in. But I think it would be fun. I mean, it's not like every episode, but I think it would be fun because through the research that you do these stories, I mean, with the cemeteries, there are so many stories that can be expanded upon, but due to the length of the episode, we can't.
Right. So sometimes when we're putting these episodes together, we have to pick and choose what facts we share. I mean, we shared the facts, but sometimes there's so much information. We're like, okay, what do we narrow down? But hopefully that inspires people to want to learn more and go out and find the additional information because there's a lot. And sometimes our episodes do turn into more than one episode on a topic. Like technically this has become a two-parter because we had General Palmer and now we've had Queen's story, but it only made sense to put those two episodes back to back so that anybody who listened to last week's episode about Palmer and heard Bob's references to Queen, now you have Queen's side of it as well. So
thank you, William, my dear husband.
So how can folks contact us on the webs?
Well, they can go to our website, the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery.com, or on Twitter at Ord Extra Sem, CEM, short for cemetery. And of course, on our Facebook page at the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast.
Yep. And you can find us on Instagram as well at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery. So if you do have a story you'd like to share with us, you can email us through the website, contact us on any of those social media sites, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, we would love it if you would consider leaving us a 5-star review. You can leave those reviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or directly on our website. And that helps us to know that we're doing well with the show and bringing you more great content.
Until we meet again.